Running away from war as thousands of Syrians risk their lives to reach Europe, the fighting rages on back home. Has the international community failed Syria, or can it finally find a way to help bring peace to the country? This is Inside Story. Welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. Millions displaced, hundreds of thousands killed, and still no solution to end the conflict in Syria. With the war now entering its fifth year, the situation on the ground remains dire, driving more Syrians towards Europe or into neighboring countries. The UN says that the mass exodus is now the world's largest single refugee crisis. More than 4 million have left the country to escape the war. That's nearly a sixth of the population. As the front lines continue to change, more people are being forced from their homes. A staggering 7.6 million people are internally displaced. And as the bombardments continue, people continue to die. The conflict has now claimed more than 220,000 lives. And the waves of refugees are now focusing renewed debate on the key cause of the crisis, the ongoing war in Syria.
The Syrians need help now. You just stop the war, and we don't want to go to Europe. Just stop the war in Syria. Just that.
Well, so far, the international community has failed to find a solution to end the fighting. The most recent attempt was last year in Geneva, but the peace talks broke down without any progress. In recent weeks, there's been a flurry of diplomatic activity, but one sticking point remains: whether Bashar al-Assad should stay or go. Russia and Iran have been staunch supporters of Assad and believes that he should be part of the political solution. But much of the West and Gulf nations believe that there's no place for Assad in the country's future. The situation on the ground remains complicated, with factions deeply divided along sectarian, ethnic and ideological lines. Allegations of foreign involvement and a fractured opposition mean the front lines are constantly changing. ISIL, a group that grew out of al-Qaeda in Iraq, has been making significant gains in Syria's central corridor and now holds this territory highlighted in red. Rebels who have so far been unable to unite against the Assad regime hold these pockets of territory in the northwest and the south. Al-Nusra Front is a powerful rebel faction that holds territory in the northwest. The Kurdish Popular Protection Units, known as the YPG, have emerged as one of the most effective forces against ISIL in Syria, controlling a large area along the Turkish border. The Syrian regime's power base remains in the west, but military defeats have left Assad little choice but to concentrate his forces in the strongholds. Well, let's now bring our guests into the discussion. Joining me here in Doha, Jean-Marc Rickley, Assistant Professor in International Security at King's College London. He's a specialist on European and Gulf security issues. In London, Nikolai Kuyanov, Visiting Fellow at Chatham House and Non-Resident Fellow at Carnegie Moscow Center. And in Tel Aviv, Ayman Jawad Al-Tamimi, Fellow at the Middle East Forum. Welcome to you all. Let's begin with Jean-Marc Rickley. To cut through the many complexities in the situation, it would appear that the most important factor in any negotiation is agreement on the fate of Bashar al-Assad.
That's correct, and I think that what we have seen lately, I'd say over the last 2 months, there was some kind of diplomatic ballet going on between Saudi Arabia, Russia, United States, and Iran, had to do with possibility to remove Assad from power. Say that two factors were important over the last 2 months: the negotiation on the nuclear capabilities. Basically, it sent a signal to the Saudis that the Americans were actually really believing in the resuming cooperation with Iran, and that basically sent some kind of shock wave in Riyadh. The Saudis looked at Russia as a way to put some pressure on the United States, and therefore there were some kind of agreement. There were economic agreement on different issues. The second thing that mattered on the ground was the situation of the Assad regime and the weakening of the regime, which for both sides is not a good news, because if the regime falls, it's very likely that ISIS will benefit from that. So what we're seeing now is a situation where the signaling for the result of the Iranian negotiation is almost finished since last Friday with the meeting of Obama and King Salman. And I think that Saudi Arabia wanted to put some pressure on the United States to get the best possible deal in return for the agreement on the nuclear negotiation. And therefore, what we see now with Russia is also probably signaling that they are committed to supporting Assad and also to strengthen the bargaining position for future negotiation regarding the fate of the regime.
Well, let me go to Nikolai Kulanov on that particular point. Russia signaling that it continues to support the Syrian government. Is there the possibility, though, that there is a rethinking in Moscow about separating out the Syrian government and the future of Bashar al-Assad?
Well, theoretically, such an opportunity it exists, but on practice, now the Russian authorities, they do believe that so far it's only Bashar Assad and his people could guarantee the survival of the Syrian governmental institutions. That's the key priority for Moscow right now. So from this point of view, I would say that the end of the nuclear negotiations, it was a bit of misleading for the international community, because after the positive role Moscow played in that negotiations, the West and partly the Arab world, they suddenly believed that the Russians can be also very helpful on Syria. But the problem is that in Syria, the Russians, they are playing their own game that is determined by their security concerns. And in order to guarantee the security of the post-Soviet space and their Muslim regions, the Russians will be fighting hard for this scenario they see as a solution in Syria. But unfortunately, this scenario is not always comply with the way how the Western powers and the regional powers see the settlement of the problem.
Well, Ayman al-Tamimi, we've heard there the phrase diplomatic ballet. There has certainly been an injection in recent weeks into a process that had appeared to be as stagnant. Is there any prospect that this may gain some traction, or are the competing factions, as we heard there from Nikolai, the reference to the fact that maybe the powers that do have influence there are more interested in furthering their own agendas than in seeking some kind of solution?
Yes, I think that's right, and I don't really see much traction in what described as the diplomatic ballet. What I would see rather is that Russia and Iran in particular, they're trying to strengthen what remains of the rump state of the Assad regime in western Syria. And in this regard comes bolstering of military support. I think you've seen it in recent days, actually, with the evidence of a Russian military presence inside of Syria and also air support. And with Iran, Iran's presence mainly, it's a small Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps personnel presence in Syria, but instead what Iran does mostly is by funding and supporting proxy militias to assist the Assad regime's survival in Syria. The dynamics of that have changed over the past year or several months because of, particularly because of the withdrawal of many Iraqi Shia fighters back to the home front, and then compensating for that has come formations of Afghan and Pakistani Shia fighters to assist the Assad regime. I mean, most of the connection with Iran is shown in that case because most of these Afghan and Pakistani Shia, they are actually refugees and persons living within Iran, and they've been recruited there to go and fight in Syria. So the way I see it, still seems like it's in terms of gearing up, it's more about force of arms and military strength and trying to consolidate that rump state rather than really pushing for a diplomatic solution that actually seriously discusses the question of Assad's fate.
Well, Jean-Marc Rickley, we've made several mentions there of ISIL. Now, some contend that there is one thing worse than the Assad regime remaining in power, and that is that it falling out of power, that there be no form of governance whatsoever, intensifying the vacuum on which ISIL thrives. Your opinion of that argument?
I think it's a legitimate point, and if we look at what happened in Syria, what happened in Iraq, what happens in Yemen now, what happened in Libya, we can see that in chaos, with chaos, this kind of situation breeds extremism, and this extremist group benefit and grow out of it. So I think both sides, even though they cannot agree on the fate of Assad, agree on the fact that if the government, the Assad government fall, then it's very likely that the situation on the ground will be even more dire, and therefore they should prevent that from happening.
Well, Nikolai Kulanov, I mean, that particular point, has there been a shift in recent years, perhaps, on that issue? Everybody now has a common enemy there, which is ISIL. Would that concentrate thoughts, perhaps, on the major players, such as the US, Iran, the Russians, to actually reach out to each other and forge some kind of agreement that can actually start a process going within Syria?
Well, there are two aspects about this. On the one hand, yes, currently we can say that most of the sides involved in the conflict, they clearly understand that it's necessary to end the confrontation, the war in Syria, and especially to prevent the Syria from following the Libyan scenario. But the problem is that the way how it should be achieved, it's seen very differently in Russia and in the West. So currently we could see that, for instance, the Russians, they goes upon the two tracks. On the one hand, they strengthening their support for the regime in order to ensure that it will make long enough to see the beginning of the negotiations. But on the other hand, they're trying to launch the national dialogue in Syria, and through the active communication with all sides, supporting all forces, government and anti-government forces in Syria. Unfortunately, this process of bringing all sides at the table of negotiation is very slow due to the difference existing in the views on the situation. But we could say that with the passage of time, we could see the gradual emergence of the common ground for cooperation. Unfortunately, Syria doesn't have this time right now.
Well, Ayman Al-Tamimi, we've spoken about the major outside players in this conflict, but there again, you have the opposition groups within Syria, which a number of years ago were heralded as the groups that would bring down the regime. But that has not manifested. The groups increasingly splintered, it would appear. No signs whatsoever of any form of unity among the groups that had pledged to bring down that government.
That's correct. And in the way that plays out in negotiations, what you find is the negotiations that actually do play out and have some result is normally between an individual group and then an outside power. So the best example of that recently is the question of the fates of the towns of Zebedani in Damascus, which is held by the rebels, and then the two remaining Shia villages in Idlib province controlled by the regime, Fu'a and Keferia. And in that case, negotiations were between Ahrar Sham, probably the single largest rebel group in Syria of Salafi orientation, and Iran. And the reason for that being that the group that was leading the assault on Fu'a and Keferia and the group leading the defense of Zebedani against a whole array of regime forces backed up by various militias. The rebel group involved, the main rebel group involved, was Ahrar Sham. So they would naturally be able to negotiate with an outside power. And in the case of Iran being that the other side of the negotiations, illustrates, of course, their very important role in continuing to bolster the regime forces on the ground. And then as for the opposition more generally, this is a problem in terms of wider solution, the fragmentation. There's been no creation of a unified command. It still remains a very distant prospect. The last initiative of that name, the Revolutionary Command Council, really is just, I think, something on paper. They couldn't agree on the formation of a unified chain of command, and then even at the local level you can continue to see coalitions fragment. The best example locally was in North Aleppo, which was something in December 2014, something called the Levant Front was formed, supposed to be a merger of 5 major rebel coalitions in Aleppo, and if it had actually succeeded, I think that would have been quite a significant breakthrough. Instead, what happened was that after 3 months, this Levant Front officially declared its dissolution, then declared its reconstitution, but you could see a number of splinters formed from it, and one could argue it is one reason among many why they're struggling to hold off the Islamic State assault pushing westward into North Aleppo countryside. So in the aggregate, yes, this fragmentation, and by the way, it's not limited to the rebels alone. The regime side has the same problem, I think, of various actors who are now trying to carve out their own spheres of influence in what remains of the rump state. Just to give a couple of examples, the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, which has built a good, significant support base in Christian areas of Homs province, and then another example, Syrian Hezbollah, which recruits from Shia and Alawites of Homs province. So both sides experiencing fragmentation. How can you bring a solution that's amenable to so many different sides?
Well, I want to actually bring up something that you mentioned there, Ayman, to Jean-Marc Rickley here. Mention of that temporary ceasefire that was created in the time of summer. I mean, as we heard there, the negotiations between Ansar and the Iranians, but also involved in that Saudi Arabia. Now, is this a template, or was this a one-off scenario that may not be repeated?
Well, I think the situation right now regarding Saudi Arabia is very much complicated since the attack on Marib last weekend. And I think that the focus of Saudi Arabia in the next few days, few weeks, will probably be on Yemen. But to reach an agreement, I think we need both sides to show some kind of goodwill, because as was said earlier, what we're witnessing over the course of the last 4.5 years is an increasing disintegration and fragmentation of the groups on the ground, and that again benefits to the extremist group. One of the most dire consequences of this are the refugee flows in Europe, the migration. That could actually put and will put some pressure on European governments to do something. The French president today said that he is considering now, and he will, France will actually extend the airstrike in Syria. So the next few days and few weeks, we should see some movements on the ground in Syria.
Well, Nikolai Kuyonov, this is an important point in terms of the flood of refugees going into Europe. Perhaps that is focusing the minds to a degree of European governments on a problem that they have not really addressed for a number of years. We've heard as well from Angela Merkel, for example, saying that she would welcome Iran as a constructive negotiator to the negotiation process. Now, Geneva 1, Geneva 2, Iran was not present. Now, because of the shifting circumstances and the pressure on Europe, the refugees, is Iran possibly emerging as a potential player? Should there ever be a Geneva 3?
Well, definitely Iran, as one of the sides that is involved in the conflict, should be invited to such events. But at the same time, I would be very cautious about its positive role in the process. It's necessary, on one hand, Iran indeed has such a strong advantage as the direct connection to Assad and the ability to speak to the regime directly. But at the same time, the goals that these countries pursuing in the region region as well as in Syria, they are far different from those goals that are pursued by the West and even Russia. So speaking about Iran, from my point of view, for the Iranian authorities, it is not always important the survival of Syria as a united country. For them, the top priority is to guarantee that there will be some areas under the control of the pro-Iranian groupings that would ensure the existence of the bridge between Tehran and its Middle Eastern proxies, namely Hezbollah in Lebanon. So from this point of view, Iran should be brought in the picture as one of the sponsors of the regime, but it probably should not be completely trusted.
Well, Ayman al-Tamimi, emerging out of that is another divergence in approach by various parties. Whether it should be approached on a national basis or not. Should Syria remain as nation? There are many groups involved who actually do not see that as desirable or do not see it as likely. How much is that part of the debate, to create or to retain a national Syria with sovereignty throughout the post-Assad regime process?
I think actually one of the problems in terms of negotiations is that ideologically there's still this very strong appeal for the unity of Syria, but on your own terms. So, for example, if you, with regards to the rebels, many of them support the idea of, of a unified Syria, and then that in turn has entailed hostility and suspicion of the Kurdish Democratic Union Party, or the PYD as its abbreviation is known, and their autonomous cantons in Jazeera and Hasaka in northeast Syria, in Kobani and Afrin. They have a big concern that they'll try to connect all these three cantons and control most of the northern border. And Turkey in turn shares that concern, and the rebels refer to it as Taqsim Syria, or division of Syria. It really doesn't seem like there are many who are actually open to this idea of a formal partition. And then the problem is then the vision of a unified Syria, if it's all on your own terms, it prevents you seeing the other side's perspective and trying to come to a common ground.
Well, Nikolai Kuyanov, I mean, on that particular aspect, from Russia's point of view, we've heard repeatedly that Russia attempting to shore up the Syrian regime. How important is it to Russia that Syria remains post-Assad process as a national state, as a national entity? Does that play any major role in Moscow's thinking?
Yes, indeed, it does. For Moscow, it's one of the red lines that Syria should be preserved as a united state. So it probably means the diluting of the powers of the center in terms of more federalization of Syria. But still, it should be preserved as a state in its current borders. And no other options, including the defragmentation of Syria or the emergence of different states, are acceptable for Russians. Well, so the only way they see Syria is still united in the same borders.
Very quickly, Jean-Marc Rickley, we heard there the Federation of Syria, the splitting it up. Is that a possibility in the long term?
I think you have to look at the situation on the ground and what can you reach from what we have. And I think a federation could be a possibility to give some kind of autonomy and sovereignty to the different parties on the ground. But I think this question cannot be decoupled to the question of Iraq, because if you agree on splitting Syria, then there will be a very legitimate claim for the Kurds, for instance, to say, hey, we will create our own state. And this is a prospect that none of the powers, the great powers, would like to see.
Well, certainly a very complex and shifting situation, a diplomatic ballet, as it was described as right at the beginning of our show. Our thanks to our guests, Nikolai Kuyanov, Ayman Jawad al-Tamimi, and here in Doha, Jean-Marc Rickley. And thank you for watching. You can contact us by going to our program page on our website, aljazeera.com. You can also leave a comment on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Mike Hanna, and the whole team, it's goodbye for now.